International news now.
So we want to begin with a brief overview of some of the most important historical events leading up to the current political, military, and economic situation in Ukraine, one in which a costly war of attrition is now over 3 years old and has created at least 1 million casualties on the sides of Russia and Ukraine combined.
The most destructive war in Europe since World War II.
Yeah. The flurry of diplomacy kicked off by President Trump's call with the Russian president on February 12th of this year provided an important stock or phase shift to this war, one that is marked by a rapid exchange of proposals and diplomatic visits designed to push negotiations forward. And we will focus most of our discussion in this news segment on what happened in the subsequent weeks since that phone call. But before we do that, we want to provide this overview of important background events that gets us to this point. And this discussion will initially take us back to the 1990s and then to 2014 and the presidential election of 2016 in the United States. And so first, we're going to begin with NATO expansion, and specifically the incorporation of new NATO members that were formerly either part of the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 ended the Cold War and ushered in a temporary thaw in the relationship between Russia and the United States. Russia badly needed economic aid to facilitate economic reforms and emerge from communism, and the United States was willing to provide this aid to support democratic institutions in Russia and the presidency of Boris Yeltsin. At the same time, many Eastern European countries sought out membership in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to provide a long-term security guarantee that could preserve their independence recently gained from Russia. It would deter Russia from reestablishing, or they hoped it would deter Russia from reestablishing its Eastern European empire. The Clinton administration saw this in similar terms, NATO expansion in similar terms, as an insurance policy to deter future Russian expansion in Eastern Europe in case Russia's democratic reforms faltered. So in the slide here, we can see multiple rounds of NATO expansion beginning in 1999 with lighter blue and then lighter green colors. It's important to understand that Vladimir Putin has long considered NATO expansion as the poison pill that led to the long-term deterioration of relations between Russia and the United States. And he argues that one of his principal reasons for going to war in 2022 was to prevent Ukraine's incorporation in both to the European Union and into NATO.
Just one final thought about that. We covered the arguments for and against NATO expansion in one of our lecture modules, and so you should take a look at that again. But there was a real controversy in the United States arguing that there were some risks to NATO expansion. And so that NATO expansion was a controversial policy decision, but one that was driven by a lot of other considerations that made it hard to resist. And so it was, in my mind, pretty inevitable, might be a little bit strong, but it had a lot of force behind it. So let's fast forward, though, to 2014 and the outbreak of a civil war in Ukraine. And so in 2013, the Ukrainian government began outreach efforts seeking membership in the European Union. In November of 2013, the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, reversed course and decided not to sign a planned association agreement with the European Union. And this decision then triggered public protests in Kyiv. These Euromaidan demonstrations that erupted in the aftermath of that decision turned violent in early 2014, and in February of that year, some European foreign ministers mediated a compromise involving a unity government and early elections. So they were sort of helping some sort of transition away from the existing government. And after the collapse of a power-sharing agreement on February 22nd of 2014, President Yanukovych disappeared from Ukraine and a new government was installed by the Ukrainian parliament. That government reoriented its foreign policy back toward Europe and away from Russia. Yanukovych, by the way, resurfaced in Russia, which says a lot. And so Russia responded to this turmoil in Ukraine by military intervention. It went in with military force and annexed Crimea, which is a part of Ukraine, in March of 2014. And by April 2014, pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions declared independence from Ukraine, leading to intensified military clashes between Ukrainian forces and these separatists. And once again, Russia intervened. It provided military aid, financial support, and some troops, some mercenaries to support the separatists. And so this civil war then, there was fighting on the territory of Ukraine, continued into the outbreak of a formal war between Russia and Ukraine in February of 2022. Now, the United States responded to the annexation of Crimea with significant economic sanctions that damaged the Russian economy and key political allies of Vladimir Putin. These sanctions partially motivated Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election in the United States. But what should be mentioned also about this was there was some debate in what was then the Obama administration about how forcefully the United States should respond to this. And it was Vice President Biden at the time that called for more support and even military support of Ukraine at that time. But the Obama administration really chose to just do this economic sanctions route that some now critique as not strong enough.
So in the summer of 2019, shortly after his election, Zelenskyy held an infamous phone call with President Trump. During the call, President Trump requested an investigation into Joe Biden and the business dealings of his son Hunter Biden in Ukraine. During the call, Trump also hinted that the continuation of an American aid package to Ukraine might depend on such an investigation. Officials in the U.S. government that participated on that call raised concern about the legality of these discussions, and Congress eventually moved forward with impeachment proceedings against Trump because of that call. Contemporary observers of Trump and his inner circle of advisors argued that this call and its after effects helped poison the personal relationship with Trump and Zelenskyy, providing an important background to the diplomatic maneuvers underway now to end the war.
I mean, that's really an important point. There's a lot of commentators that say that President Trump hates Zelenskyy because of this incident and that is part of the calculus here.
Yeah. So the inauguration of President Biden in 2021 reoriented U.S. foreign policy in a way that significantly favored multilateral cooperation with fellow democracies. To the extent we can think about that was traditional U.S. foreign policy, Trump reorients the movement away to multilateral cooperation with democracies, and then Biden reorients the U.S. foreign policy back to its traditional norms of let's embrace cooperation, multilateral cooperation with other democracies. Biden also adopted a supportive policy stance relative to Ukraine and President Zelenskyy. And over the course of the fall of 2021 and January and February of 2022, the Biden administration launched an ambitious intelligence sharing operation with its European allies and the Ukrainian government that detailed extensive Russian maneuvers and military preparations along its border with Ukraine. The Biden administration felt strongly that war was imminent. Ultimately, they were correct. Russia launched an ambitious ground invasion against Ukraine in February of 2022. It initially incorporated the separatist republics in the east, conquered additional territories in northern Ukraine and in the areas adjacent to the separatist republics, and tried to seize the capital city of Ukraine. And on this slide, you can see some of the rapid territorial gains that Russia initially made in the spring of 2022.
Yeah, that's right. At the beginning, I mean, we were covering this in this class back then, and we both expected this war to end pretty quickly in Russia's favor. I mean, there's a dramatic difference in the size of militaries and resources between Russia and Ukraine. The thing that made the difference, though, was European and American aid to Ukraine. And so that's the story now that we'll get to. Europe and the United States responded with a really dramatic outpouring of political, military, economic, and intelligence support that strengthened the Ukrainian military and enabled it to resist Russian advances. And this response, again, I'll just emphasize, was a bit surprising, at least to me. I think to both of us. We didn't really think that the Biden administration, and particularly the Biden administration and its European allies, could really get together and have a united front that would expend that kind of support. And the reason we didn't think so was, again, going back to the historical context, the Obama administration didn't do this same thing.
Yep.
Right? Now, this was a bigger incursion, so that might be the reason why. But this was a surprising amount of support. And so by the start of 2025, the United States had allocated $119 billion in aid to Ukraine, and with $64 billion of that designated for military support. And this military support is the most support given by any individual country, especially, and the European Union, which is a collection of countries, collectively pledged around $138 billion, and about $53 billion of that was military aid. Western countries have also extended substantial financial and humanitarian assistance. The EU's financial aid amounts to about $68 billion, primarily in loans, while the U.S. provided about $46 billion in financial support, which was predominantly as grants. This support did not include the deployment of U.S. or NATO forces into the conflict zones. And that was really important because the Biden administration didn't want to risk direct military conflict with Russia. So, however, the U.S. and NATO did provide substantial amounts of modern military hardware, and that was a crucial difference maker. It enabled Ukraine to fight an ambitious, modern military campaign that was itself aided by drones and embedded software engineers that incorporated intelligence from Western sources and constant real-time updates from ground forces via artificial intelligence systems to make real-time targeting decisions. It was a sophisticated military campaign, and one that arguably some military experts say has changed the way that all countries are going to fight wars moving forward, right? And so Western military support was undoubtedly helpful in extending this war, right, by helping prevent the rapid Russian conquest of Ukraine. And, you know, you saw this, there was this very dramatic moment in the war where there was lines of tanks, remember, on its way to Kyiv.
Yep.
And the drones and the military intelligence and everything stopped them in their tracks, you know, disabled all the tanks and sent them packing backwards. And there was a real retreat in that period of Russian forces, and they lost a lot of territory. And so it was a shocking.
Well, it was significant, and it prevented the conquest of Kyiv, which then would have probably meant Zelenskyy fleeing to European territories and the collapse of internal political support for the war effort in Ukraine.
Right. And so now, at the end of February 2025, right now, the war is now responsible for at least 1 million total military casualties on both sides. Now, estimates from multiple sources suggest that about 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers are either confirmed dead or, you know, irretrievably lost, and anywhere between 150,000 and 225,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. Currently, the front lines include about 250,000 Ukrainian soldiers, arrayed against about 400,000 Russian soldiers. So the discrepancy is still there, right? Russia has many more soldiers at their command and resources. Russian lines have been fortified with between 12,000 and 15,000 North Korean troops since last fall. And Ukraine has claimed that at least 3,000 of those troops have died in battle. So, question is, why did Putin's Russia launch this war in the first place? And you already learned about some of the most prominent political explanations for this war in your modules from last week. And we just want to emphasize here a commitment problem story that helps explain this, where Russia invaded Ukraine because Ukraine could not credibly commit to staying out of an alliance with NATO at some point in the medium to long-term future. And Ukraine fought in this war because Russia could not commit to respecting its sovereign independence in the short to medium term either. And so that was the heart of the conflict.
It's the heart of the conflict that led to the start of the war, and it now will be the heart of the conflict to construct a political peace settlement that will terminate the war.
And that same commitment problem could keep this war going despite all the efforts underway to get to a ceasefire and eventually peace.
Okay, so let's now transition into the second part of this discussion that focuses on the rapid acceleration of peace maneuvers by President Trump that appear to be designed to pressure Ukraine into accepting some set of concessions to both Russia and the United States that will end the war. So it's not enough for Ukraine to make concessions to Russia. Ukraine is now going to make concessions to the United States to get out of this war. So we're going to begin with a quick survey of these developments, and then we'll go into more detail by working through a recent explainer video from, I did it again, CBC News that examines the significance of the minerals deal to these peace negotiations.
CBC stands for?
The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Canada.
I made this mistake the last time. I want to apologize to our Canadian friends because I don't want to be part of any of this business and antagonizing them for no reason. Right?
From
I'm from northern Minnesota. The Canadians are good people. Come on. There's no reason to have a fight. All right.
Anyway, go.
So we're going to start this brief timeline with the extended phone call between Presidents Trump and Putin on February 12th. At this point, they agreed to initiate peace talks to end the war in Ukraine.
Okay, so realize February 12th, like this was just 2 weeks ago.
2.5 weeks
ago.
Right.
We're going to go rapid fire. Every day something happens.
Yeah, and again, we are filming this on the morning of February 28th.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So, February 14th, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance criticizes Europe on free speech and immigration at the Munich Security Conference. That's what Mertz was referring to about election interference that we discussed in the introduction. These comments from J.D. Vance and efforts by Elon Musk sparked tensions between the United States and German leaders, who, as we noted earlier, later described this as worse election interference than anything Russia had done. These remarks overshadowed discussions on Ukraine. Zelenskyy, at the Munich Security Conference, Zelenskyy stated that he would not accept a peace deal without Ukraine at the negotiating table, right? He is responding to news of the Trump-Putin call on February 12th, saying, you're not going to get a peace by excluding me. On February 16th, 2025, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that Ukraine and European nations would be included in any, quote, real negotiations to resolve the conflict. On the same day, Trump affirmed that Zelenskyy will be involved in the peace talks. On February 18th, but then, right, a few days later, on February 18th, American and Russian delegations, led by Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, respectively, met in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, to develop a framework for future negotiations on ending the war in Ukraine. Notably, again, Ukraine was not invited to these initial discussions.
They weren't real negotiations. They were just a start, just a chat, really. Okay, so then, on February 19th, 2025, Zelenskyy rejected the United States demands for $500 billion in mineral wealth from Ukraine to repay Washington for wartime aid, or a 50% stake in Ukraine's mineral and oil resources, which was a big ask, right? And so Zelenskyy said at the time the United States had supplied nowhere near that sum of $500 million. As we've already stated, it was more like $119 billion, right? Nowhere near that $500 billion sum so far, and offered no specific security guarantees in the agreement, and so he rejected it. And on February 19th, same day, President Trump called Zelenskyy a dictator without elections and blamed Ukraine for Russia's invasion of that country, saying it had years to make a deal with Russia without the loss of much land. And so he criticized Ukraine for sort of instigating this conflict because it didn't concede land to prevent it, right? And so
let's just let that sink in. He criticized Ukraine for protecting its sovereign independence.
Right, and not giving up land, right.
Yeah.
So later that day, again, we're still in February 19th, Zelenskyy stated that he was not offended by the remark and emphasized instead the importance of focusing on Ukraine and its defense and sovereignty rather than engaging in personal disputes. He also suggested that President Trump might be influenced by misinformation, describing him as living in a disinformation bubble. So he said, I don't want to get into personal disputes, and then he got into a personal dispute. Okay, stay disciplined, man. But anyway, Trump again then warned President Zelenskyy to move fast in negotiations around an end to the conflict with Russia, suggesting that delays could jeopardize Ukraine's position. And in his words, he said, Zelenskyy might not have a country if he doesn't move fast. And so gets us a little closer to today, but then a lot of war has happened.
Yeah, so on February 23rd, 2025, Zelenskyy stated his willingness to give up the presidency for peace in Ukraine or NATO membership. Additionally, on Sunday, February 23rd, Germany also held new federal elections that left the CDU, a center-right party with the most parliamentary seats, and their leader, Merz, will likely be the next chancellor of Germany. They're now negotiating coalitional arrangements with the Socialist Party. On February 24th, 2025, European foreign ministers convened an emergency meeting in Brussels to discuss President Trump's push to end the Ukraine war. Despite concerns about Trump's statements, EU ministers struggled to finalize a new aid package for Ukraine, initially proposed at $6.3 billion, with potential increases. On that same Monday, February 24th, the U.S. voted alongside Russia at the United Nations in opposition to a European-sponsored resolution that condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Instead, the U.S. backed a resolution calling for an end to the conflict without criticizing Russia, which marks a significant shift in its stance and a deepening rift with European allies. The French President Macron visited the United States on Monday, February 24th, to encourage President Trump to include Zelenskyy in any peace talks, and he was pressuring or encouraging Dear Donald, as he likes to call him, to provide U.S. troops as a security guarantee to any peace settlement.
Okay. So then on February 25th, 2025, the Kremlin, Russia's government, dismissed President Trump's assertion that President Putin would accept European peacekeeping troops in Ukraine. And the Russian government stated that any NATO-aligned forces in the region are unacceptable to Russia. So there's Russia inserting itself and sort of complicating this agenda. Additionally, on February 25th, Ukraine and the United States reached an agreement on a framework for a broad economic deal that would include access to the United States of Ukraine's rare earth minerals. And so then you get a little swing back away. Russia's being troublesome, and things are working a little better with Ukraine and the United States. Then the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, visited the White House on Thursday, February 27th. He pledged that British troops would participate in an international peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Now that's complicated by Russia saying it wouldn't tolerate any NATO-aligned troops, but he also encouraged the United States to provide security guarantees to Ukraine that would help to deter future Russian military action after any ceasefire or peace settlement. And And then today, Friday, February 28th, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is traveling, or is here now in the United States to meet with President Trump and to sign the agreement regarding rare earth minerals and access to that. And the reports on that agreement indicate that Zelenskyy will also discuss continued military aid to Ukraine. In his comments to journalists before the meeting, Zelenskyy again warned that no agreement can succeed without sufficient Western security guarantees. And we should note the wording there, can succeed, because he's already committed to signing an agreement, and the reports about that agreement is that's at best a vague, very vague language about U.S. Support for Ukrainian security. So,
Okay.
now let's say a word about this litany of events. That might be a little like overwhelming, I guess, if you hear us going through all the stuff. The point isn't for you to know every single one of those things in order. It'd be nice. No, I'm just kidding. But it's to just give you a picture of the scale of activity and change that's happened over the past 2 weeks.
Yeah.
A lot has happened. And so.
Yeah, the war is in a new phase.
Yes.
I think everyone in the world would agree that the war is in a new phase, and everyone would also agree that President Trump put the war in a new phase by kickstarting peace talks.
Definitely.
Yes.
And just to emphasize this, the war was, and it has been for at least a year, if not more, in a stalemate. Neither Russia nor Ukraine could make any real progress in capturing new land. Russia was making some inroads here, but it wasn't getting anywhere close to any of its ultimate goals of taking over all of Ukraine. Ukraine had some success earlier in the war in pushing back Russia, but it hasn't for a very long time gotten anywhere in terms of recapturing land that Russia is currently occupying. And so there's this stalemate that has been depleting both militaries. And so they were inching closer and closer to being like, we can't keep this up and we're not getting where we want to go. But they were still months away until President Trump got elected, and President Trump, started a process that's going to cause some change here. Yeah. Right. We'll see what.
Okay, now that we have the timeline established for the February push to peace in Ukraine that was initiated by Trump, we want to work through an excellent explainer video produced by CBC News, thanks to Canada, right, that puts some of the most important of these developments in a broader perspective. It begins and ends with a discussion of the minerals deal. Now, while Trump publicly justifies these concessions from Ukraine as compensation for U.S. military support during the war, we want to encourage you to think about these components of any peace deal as part of a security guarantee that Ukraine wants as a condition to stop fighting. Ukraine is worried that Russia cannot credibly commit to preserving any negotiated terms for peace indefinitely into the future. Ukraine's worried that Russia might just wait until Europe and the United States pull its support and then attack again when Ukraine is weak. So some form of a security guarantee, both in terms of, say, NATO membership and European and American peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, might alleviate some of these concerns and make it harder for Russia to break its promises without risking NATO in the future.
Now, can I interrupt here? Would you say that we mentioned just now NATO membership and European peacekeeping and American peacekeeping? Are you suggesting that that's all of those are necessary to deter Russia, or
no?
And that's what I'm saying. That's
Yeah.
why I interrupt, because NATO membership right now, at least, and I would say probably into the future is off the table because the Trump administration has taken it off the table.
Can I add?
Yeah.
It might not even just be off the table. It might not mean as much if Trump ultimately pulls the United States out of NATO and weakens it completely.
Right. And so the question is going to be whether some form of peacekeeping, European only or European and American. Right now, I can't see American troops in Ukraine either. It would be a sufficient sort of tripwire kind of deterrence.
And we got to add to this. I forgot to add this in. So again, we're filming on Friday. Yesterday, there's a press briefing between Starmer and Trump, where the British press is pressing Trump about, do you really think Putin will live up to the terms of any peace deal? And he says, oh yeah, I know Vladimir. We've talked about it. We think he'll live up. And then they were like, but the British Prime Minister here has a very different perspective. He's saying we can't trust Putin, and so we need all these security guarantees, which is why the UK is willing to put troops in. How do you explain this distinction? And Trump said, well, we'll trust but verify, right? Okay. And so the journalists intentionally highlighted this commitment problem story and the need for security guarantees and the gap that exists between European heads of state and the United States about the necessity of these security guarantees to preserve any peace agreement. Right. And it's important to remember, if we don't solve the commitment problem and get guarantees into the future, then Ukraine's incentives for stopping fighting will be dramatically diminished. Right. Okay, so at the same time of all this, Ukraine is worried that these European security guarantees, such as from Starmer and from Macron, might fall apart without American participation. So if so, the idea here is giving the Trump administration an economic stake in Ukraine, and the subsequent peace might be a way to incentivize the United States to participate in the peace over the long run. In other words, security guarantees from Europe and the US vested interest in Ukrainian minerals might act like commitment technologies that can help preserve any peace once the two sides lay down their arms. And as a consequence, encourage them to stop fighting in the first place. This is an expectations game, right? In order to get peace now, you have to shape expectations in the future. That's the logic of the commitment problem. This is the broader theoretical logic. So let's go ahead.
No, wait, let's just say, even the Trump administration and President Trump himself understands this inherently, at least, right? I mean, he's not going to use the term commitment problem, but he says, when asked about the mineral rights deal, he says, and a security guarantee, and he's always balking at an explicit security guarantee. The best security guarantee for Ukraine is an economic relationship with the United States. So he can see the interlocking logic there that an economic deal could invest the United States in the survival and success of a Ukrainian state and act like that commitment trigger.
But we have to emphasize here, the devil is in the details, and we don't have the details on this mineral deal because that will set the scope of American investment and interest in preserving this. And one thing we haven't talked about, what we're going to do at the end is, what territories are these mineral deals going to come from? Because guess what? Vladimir Putin is saying, sure, the U.S. can invest in territories of Ukraine that I've taken in the last 3 years. That opens up a whole other question that we got to talk about. All right, so let's go ahead and run the first clip from CBC.
Donald Trump has just hit fast forward on a war that has been locked, frozen in fighting for 3 years now.
Multiple reports that the U.S. and Ukraine have reached a deal on critical minerals.
I hear that he's coming on Friday. Certainly it's okay with me if he'd like to, and he would like to sign it together with me.
Trump confirms the U.S. will gain access to critical Ukrainian mineral deposits.
It's a very big deal. Look, it could be $1 trillion deal, it could be whatever, but it's rare earths and other things.
It's what Trump has long wanted, compensation for the U.S. supporting Ukraine.
I told them that I want the equivalent, like $500 billion worth of rare earth, and they've essentially agreed to do that.
But remember, Trump and his team have also been negotiating with Russia, trying to end the war. So it was strange to hear a reporter ask, what does Ukraine get for giving up its minerals to the US? And Trump said this.
$350 billion and lots of equipment and military equipment and the right to fight on and originally the right to fight.
The right to fight on, which you might interpret as the US being happy to now allow the war to continue for at least some period of time, so long as the US is properly compensated.
I mean, that's what I do. I do deals. My whole life is deals. That's all I know is deals.
This is one example of many in this war, where the US has moved at breakneck speed for Trump to collect what he feels the US is owed, but leaving everyone else scrambling to make deals of their own.
We've never had such movement in a given period of time ever in this whole conflict.
There are painfully few details right now about exactly what's in this US-Ukraine mineral deal. The BBC reports Ukraine may give up 50% of resource revenue to the US. The New York Times seemed to cast doubt on whether Ukraine might get security guarantees in exchange.
So we've got a tentative deal over rare earth minerals in Ukraine. It's going to be signed on February 28th. Trump wants some form of saying it's going to be around $500 billion as compensation for its aid, but we're unclear about the exact terms. Let's just step back and think about what all this means. Trump and the United States are extracting from Ukraine at a moment of weakness. Note that this suggests that Ukraine must not only make concessions to Russia to get peace, has been implied by public statements suggesting that Ukraine will not hold all the territory within its borders that had been established in 1991. So the expectation is that Ukraine's going to have to make some territorial concessions, but now Ukraine has also got to make important mineral concessions to the United States. Also important, but not discussed here, it's not clear how any of these concessions would be actualized for the United States. What I've seen and heard in podcasts and read is that it's going to take substantial investment in infrastructure, roads, railways, mining support, and logistics to get them out. It's not clear who's going to pay for this, whether Ukraine is going to pay for this, the U.S. is going to pay for it, whether it's going to be the U.S. government, whether it's going to be private investors in the United States that's going to pay them about this. And then the third thing that's important here that Rob and I were just discussing, does this deal include any security guarantees? The language of the statements that come out of Friday are really important, but this is all unclear or to be determined. And I think I'm comfortable saying that we're not going to see anything specific in terms of security guarantees that's really going to reassure the Ukrainians. So let's go ahead and run the second clip that talks about recent developments at the United Nations.
But Fox News quotes Trump as promising some measure of general security for Ukraine later on. I don't think that's going to be a problem. But while Trump attempts to extract value out of Ukraine as it wages war, he has also invited Vladimir Putin, the aggressor in the war, into the fold. And he's done this as openly as possible.
We shall now begin the voting process.
So let me set the scene for you, because what happened at the UN this week will help you understand the chaos Trump has caused internationally. The UN General Assembly is not generally where you'll find high drama.
The Assembly will turn to draft resolution A/ES 11/L10.
But this resolution, A/ES11/L10, saw a dramatic reversal of US foreign policy, where the American delegation explicitly took the side of Russia, North Korea, Hungary, Belarus, and others. So what's in the resolution? Well, two paragraphs the US appears to have taken issue with. This one stating plainly that Russia invaded Ukraine, not exactly up for debate. And this one, which seems to basically only suggest that Ukraine is a country with borders that ought to be respected. Again, this isn't usually controversial, but the US voted against this resolution.
That was frankly jaw-dropping.
That was a fundamental shift. Fundamental.
Here's a look at the massive TV screen at the UN, which shows how every single country voted. And here's the American no vote, which is in line with Russia, North Korea, Hungary, and Belarus. Despite this, most of the world still seems to believe in Ukrainian sovereignty.
Even China abstained from this.
Adopted.
And while this pleases Ukraine, Russia had little to no reaction and same with the US.
The status quo has been completely turned upside down. Many Europeans have their hair on fire trying to figure out what to do now. In broad terms, everybody is trying to take a deep breath to go from the initial shock of Trump's outreach to Putin and get in the game, sit down with American officials and have influence.
All right, so we've covered this a little bit, but I think it bears repeating again. We got to let this sink in for a while. This set of moves, especially at the United Nations, was a dramatic reversal of U.S. foreign policy. It was a fundamental, in the words of the commandant, fundamental shift. And again, in our
language of cupcake.
The Europeans have their hair on fire. So he's old, and I don't know if that saying still applies. But what happened? The U.S. voted with Russia, North Korea, Belarus. These are states that are, on the periphery of respectability. And
That's kind of sugarcoating it. These are traditional adversaries of the United States, right? These are rogue states.
Yeah, okay. So, and the United States found itself on that side rather than the side of most of the other countries. Why? Because it didn't want to publicly state that Russia invaded Ukraine. And this is the sharpest red line between the previous administration and, decades of U.S. foreign policy and this current administration. And this vote reflects then this much broader reconfiguration of the distribution of political interests among states in the world. This is the first time since 1945 that the United States has ever voted with Russia and against Europe on any United Nations resolution. And some of you might rightfully ask, but does this really matter? Well, it doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. The United Nations can't enforce its resolutions. It's just a deliberative body for diplomats to talk and heads of states to give speeches. Yes, but that is why it is important, because it provides a forum to give all members voice in a larger global political order. And by institutionalizing such opportunities to give voice to your positions, it confers legitimacy on decisions that emerge from its body. And in this case, it publicly exposes to the world, it publicly showcases really how extreme the administration's views on the war have become, the war in Ukraine have become. And its views on who deserves responsibility for the start and outbreak of this war. Actions like this, the United States siding on one side of a UN vote as opposed to the other, have consequences for both politicians and for public opinion in other countries around the world. And in the immediate term, actions like this are contributing significantly to this emerging split between the United States and Europe. Because no matter what happens with this peace deal, that the positions have been set that the United States has kind of switched sides in its support in the Ukraine war. Now that could shift back, with other statements by the United States, but as it stands now, this is just a enormous change in how the United States has portrayed itself. So let's move on to the third clip. That examines President Emmanuel Macron's visit to the White House last week.
President Trump is at the White House meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron to talk about ending the war.
I think the arrival of President Trump is a game changer. My concern is that we have to go fast.
France's president met this week with Donald Trump at the White House, what journalists like to call a charm offensive.
Thank you, dear Donald. Cher Donald. Cher Donald. Merci, cher Donald.
But with the main goal being to have a kind of American guarantee on security in Ukraine, American military heft to enforce peace.
Nous voulons la paix, on est totalement d'accord. Nous voulons un deal rapide, mais pas mais pas un accord qui soit fragile.
He hinted at the United States providing what is called a backstop to the security force.
A backstop, because the single biggest question mark in all of the deal making that's happening right now is how to ensure, once the fighting stops, that Russia or even Ukraine won't just start it up again. But the Trump administration has been very clear on 2 points. One, it does not want to put American soldiers in harm's way in Ukraine. And two, it expects Europe to do so.
Europe must play its role. And I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground.
Following Emmanuel Macron's visit and ahead of his own this week, the UK's Keir Starmer announced what he likely hopes will be seen by Trump as reassuring news. A plan to increase the country's military spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027, even increasing to 3% shortly after that. But not every European country can afford to make the same promise.
Doubling defense spending would mean massive tax increases or significant cuts in social welfare programs. Countries can't ramp up their spending that quickly because they can't, double the size of the military.
And that people power is a problem. I've seen some estimates of what size peacekeeping force would be needed in Ukraine go as high as 200,000. Europe would be extremely hard-pressed to generate those kinds of numbers without the US acting as a backstop.
It is very difficult to see how in the short term Europe can muster those troops.
They can't do it without US backing. Logistical support, intelligence, electronic surveillance, satellite coverage.
So this clip discusses Macron's visit to the United States. And what does it argue was its primary purpose? To solve the commitment problem that is currently incentivizing both Ukraine and Russia to continue fighting their war. When Macron talks about avoiding a fragile agreement or a fragile deal, he means that this fragility would allow Putin to resume fighting, to presumably take more territory after both Ukraine stops fighting and Western aid to Ukraine stops as well. And this is important. If Putin cannot provide a credible commitment not to resume fighting in the future, then Ukraine is not going to want to stop fighting now, because it will get weaker as soon as it demobilizes its army and tells its people to return to their civilian jobs. And if Ukraine gets weaker, then it will be in a worse negotiating position after fighting resumes. So Ukraine keeps fighting now to avoid future concessions in case it mistakenly believes that Putin is committed to peace. And how does Macron want to solve these strategic dilemmas? With a series of security guarantees that both European states like France and the United States would provide to Ukraine. And again, these could come in the form of NATO membership and NATO peacekeepers on the ground to police the peace terms. And essentially what was going on this week is the beginning of these negotiations or what these security guarantees would look like, okay? Now, the idea though is that these security guarantees would deter Putin from launching a future war and as a result, make the current peace more robust. Now, if Macron thinks this is how we get peace, with US troops and a US security guarantee, or maybe without US troops initially, but some form of a US security guarantee, or the US signing off on Ukrainian membership in NATO, we can see here that the challenges that Trump faces now in securing a peace. He doesn't want to provide these commitment technologies. So we have a puzzle. Trump wants a peace and says he can deliver it, but he doesn't want to provide what other European leaders and Ukraine view as the necessities for that peace.
All right, so the video also discusses how other leaders, particularly Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom, are trying to encourage President Trump to make these pledges by increasing their contributions, those countries' contributions to the collective defense of Europe, both in terms of defense spending and troops on the ground in Ukraine. But the video reveals another dilemma to peace that underscores the centrality of the United States to the entire deal. European defense capacity depends in large part on logistical and hardware support from the United States, and it is unclear whether Europe can provide the required security guarantees on its own. And in this strategic possibility, we can understand more the positioning of Germany's future Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, his immediate goals are to build up European independence from the United States as soon as possible. You know, and so let's now go back to the video and the fourth clip here that brings us full circle, linking together the discussions of the mineral deal with security guarantees and the commitment problem. Let's run that clip.
So this is where things come back full circle to the mineral deal. Because if you take what Trump recently said at face value, that he's actually willing to fuel Ukraine's ongoing war as long as the US receives critical minerals in exchange, you might wonder if this actually takes the conflict further away from peace. But there's another more hopeful way of looking at things.
The idea being that if they give the mineral deal that the Americans are kind of happy with, they would have a stake, an interest in providing a backstop to make sure that the peace agreement remains intact.
This might explain why you're very unlikely to see Ukraine's key allies denigrating this deal. Because you could certainly find in commentary online accusations that the US is pillaging Ukraine, referring to any potential deal as predatory exploitation, even extortion. But by Ukraine's own account, this is a deal they've sought out and are keen to make happen, with one of the country's deputy prime ministers trumpeting online, Ukrainian and US teams are in the final stages of negotiations.
These deposits are priceless. It is huge amounts of money. Huge. That is why we need to protect it. So if we are talking about a deal, that's what the Americans want, then let's do a deal.
I think that right now there is fear, some of it probably justified, that Uncle Sam is packing his bags and going home. And that when Trump talks about Ukraine causing the war, when he calls Zelenskyy a dictator, when he talks about restarting US-Russian economic relations, many Europeans are saying that, you know, this is it. This is kind of the end of the transatlantic partnership that emerged over the course of the 20th century. Let's demonstrate to him that the transatlantic partnership still matters.
But right now, what's not at all clear is which partnerships Trump values most. While negotiating with Ukraine for its minerals, Trump has also apparently opened talks with the Russians for their minerals as well. And Putin himself may even be willing to offer Trump the spoils of his invasion.
Да, кстати говоря, что касается новых территорий, то же самое. Мы готовы привлечь иностранных партнеров.
This is an interview with state media where Putin is inviting foreign investment in rare metal reserves, but specifically ones that are in quote-unquote new territories. That sounds like he's referring to Ukraine, and specifically that part of Ukraine which Russia now controls, which hold critical mineral deposits like graphite, lithium, and zirconium that the US wants and needs.
I think many Europeans right now are to some extent in a state of shock. They have hit the panic button. Nobody knows where Trump is going to go in the weeks and months ahead.
We should be getting more clarity on the US-Ukraine mineral deal soon, but what is likely to take much longer, according to the experts we spoke to, any actual peace agreement. To think it could only take weeks would be naive, as one expert put it to us. And if that's true, that means at least three things. Ukraine will have to continue to withstand Russian aggression. Europe will keep scrambling for Trump's attention, and Trump himself will have more time to extract from this conflict whatever he feels is best.
All right, here the clip wants to cast a more positive outlook. That peace may be on the horizon. It's going to take a little while, but it's seeming to suggest that the minerals deal could actually help to create it, right? And here we come back to it. Can the minerals deal lock the United States into this agreement to give it a long-term stake in the preservation of any peace between Russia and Ukraine? However, it also provides reason for skepticism. Trump is also opening negotiations with Russia at the same time. And Putin is suggesting that Russia is willing to make concessions on mineral rights it has seized from Ukraine. How generous of him, right? But something to watch here. Putin has a political reason to get Trump and the United States vested in the minerals in Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine. Because if you get U.S. investment in these territories, then the U.S. effectively recognizes this transfer of sovereignty and territorial rights to Russia by cutting a deal with Putin. So in short, Putin can secure official recognition from the United States by binding the United States to some type of economic deal in the disputed territories. Okay, so in this final segment, we want to finish up. We're going to move to an interview format and discussion that leverages Professor Moser's specialization in Russian politics. And we're going to turn to him for more insight into what Putin is trying to accomplish here and what might all of this might mean for U.S. grand strategy. So first, Rob, do you want to just give us briefly some sense of how you're reading Putin here and what you think he wants from these negotiations?
Yeah, so I think his long-term goals are the same as they always have been. He wants to subdue Ukraine. He doesn't necessarily need to occupy Ukraine, but he does need to influence domestic Ukrainian politics. And so he, I think, is angling for that. In the short term, I think he wants peace negotiations to start, but he doesn't necessarily need them or even want them to end anytime soon, because the negotiations themselves have already provided huge benefits for Russia in the sense that it's given him legitimacy, it's brought him back into the fold with the most powerful country in the world, the United States. You know,
he's flipped the U.S. at the UN.
Yeah, I mean, all of these things just with the prospect of a quick peace deal. But what's interesting is the actor that is going faster than anyone else is Donald Trump. But it's the Russians and the Ukrainians who are much more cautious and slower because they have other interests in mind besides just getting a ceasefire, getting a peace deal, and the benefits that come with that. They are more, eager to make sure their long-term interests. For Russia, it is extending their, influence into Eastern Europe, predominantly Ukraine now, but I'm still they want more than that. Baltic states, all sorts of other things. And on Ukraine's side, they want to survive. And they're not sure that a peace deal right now is going to do that.
And let me add one more benefit to Putin here. Simply by having these negotiations, long-term grand strategy benefit, it's splitting the United States from Europe.
Yeah.
Right,
no,
which makes Europe weaker, which makes the United States weaker, which makes it, circling back to where you just finished, easier for Putin to think about, let's retake the Baltic states.
Right.
So what do you think Trump wants in all this?
The Trump angle here is complicated and interesting. I'd say first and foremost, Trump wants to fulfill a campaign promise. He wants to show that an active, energetic administration in the United States can change the stalemated war, and he has done that. He has changed the game, right? And so there is political benefits for him of just doing that. He said that this war should have never happened in the first place. It would have never happened if he were president. And then he wants to demonstrate, and I can end it quickly once I'm in power. And now he's trying to demonstrate that. And he's doing it in unconventional ways like he often does. But there are a few things I'll point out that he's not wrong about. One of them is the facts on the ground strongly suggest, to use the mildest terms, that Ukraine is never really going to have much chance of regaining the territory that Russia occupies right now. That there was always the final resolution, all the experts say, and even members of the Biden administration would privately say, even though the public stance was different, that Ukraine needs to get all of its territory back. They always knew that the resolution was going to be some sort of territory for security exchange. And President Trump has sort of bulldozed that concession into existence now, at least for the time being. But I think that what I think he doesn't emphasize is more important than what he wants to. He wants a quick end to this war for domestic reasons and for his own international prestige. If he can get this peace deal and a ceasefire, bam, he's done something no one else could do. But he doesn't care as much, at least, of what this does for Putin and Russia and that state that started this whole mess in the first place. He's perfectly comfortable just bringing them back into the fold, repairing U.S. relations with Russia. He doesn't really mind the fallout between the United States and Europe. And there's a grander sort of strategic vision here that he's executing his restraint, right? His, pulling the U.S. and its responsibilities back, right? And so all of those things that are so problematic from, my perspective, but also Europeans, all the things we've all talked about, that's not a central concern. Because he thinks that that's an unreasonable responsibility for the United States.
Yeah.
And he's resetting that, and he's resetting those expectations. And I disagree with that in the long-term strategic interest of the United States. But that's a disagreement. He has a different vision, and he's executing that vision. And it's going to reset everything.
Yeah.
So,
no, this is important, right? And I'm glad you raised this, and I didn't think about it in these terms until listening to you talk, right? And so another way we can understand these negotiations as a political device to institutionalize a transformed U.S. relationship with its alliances by destroying the institutionalization of it, right? So you create a fundamental break with your alliances to then pull back from those long-term commitments and institute a grand strategy of restraint that leaves the United States without any security obligations to Europe.
Right. And that, I would say, is a stark difference from the first Trump administration and this Trump administration. There were members in the first Trump administration who were stalwarts, and you don't break NATO, you don't break these arrangements. They're really important. You have members in the administration, particularly Marco Rubio, that I still think believe that, but they are not saying that.
Yeah.
And so
let's go to one question. We'll skip this one. Is that okay?
Sure.
And this is going to circle back to some of the things that we were talking before, and probably some slight disagreement between our positions. This will be the last one. My question for you is Trump winning here?
At the moment, I'd say yes.
And are these minerals deals really big concessions to Trump? And is he really getting all that he wants? What do you think?
So, okay, I will separate out reality from perception. I think it's important what the perception is almost as much as what the reality is. Are these big concessions to Trump? Perceptually, yes. He will get something out of this that he can take to his base and say, finally, someone's looking out for American financial interests and not just trying to get the United States to bankroll, wars and things like that. And so, in reality, those minerals are hard to get to. They're going to cost a lot of money to get to. It's going to be a very involved process to get to them. And Ukraine was never going to get to them in any near or long-term thing. So they're not giving up nearly as much as I think it seems like it. That 500 billion is a big number, but when you're fighting for your life, take all the minerals. We're not going to use them anytime soon, kind of thing. And so he's winning in the sense that he has changed the whole discussion. This was a stalemated war that, without him doing these things, would have remained a stalemated war until who knows when. He's changed the game. Is he going to get what he wants? That, I think, is a harder yes. I kind of doubt it. I don't think he's going to get the quick peace deal. I don't think he's going to get even a quick ceasefire because both sides still have longer-term interests that a quick ceasefire doesn't fulfill. And so either side could just say, we don't trust the security guarantees, and Ukraine refuses to stop fighting. Or Russia says, yeah, this is really interesting. Let's keep talking. and then the fighting keeps going. What's going to be crucial, and you made a good point in our private conversations, is if that happens, he's got a decision to make. Does he keep funding with military aid the Ukrainian side to keep the stalemate going? I say yes, because then the eventual peace deal that he still wants to be the center of, he has leverage, right? Because he has leverage over Ukraine and over Russia by continuing to support Ukraine. But I think you make a good point that politically, I think everything he says would suggest he wants to get out of supporting Ukraine business as fast as possible.
Yeah. I'm not convinced that in the question that he's winning, and it's interesting to me to watch the media discuss this in the last week, and everyone's saying Trump is getting all that he wants. All these foreign leaders are coming here. There's a new state visit that the King of Great Britain, United Kingdom invited. King Charles invited Trump for an unprecedented second state visit. Nobody has ever done this before. I'm not sure that this is more than a short-term PR win for President Trump, and that might be enough for him politically. But to me, this seems like a trap, right? That if he really wants, a trap for him given his political goals. And as you said, he's going to have to wrestle with this at some point, which is
make a decision.
Yes, right. And the trap is that if he really wants to get peace, he's going to have to offer some type of concessions that solve this commitment problem. But he doesn't want to do that. And short of American guarantees, they keep fighting. And 6, 7, 8 months from now, or the early spring of 2026, when Democrats start getting ready to run for midterm elections, and they say, where's the peace that you promised and that you got these minerals, and oh yeah, how much money have you extracted out of this minerals deal? And now he's got a political problem. And the problem, in some senses, is one of his own making, because the Europeans and the Ukrainians are saying, this is what we need to stop fighting. And he clearly doesn't want to provide it.
So let me I know we're going over, but so what if he says, okay, well then I'm just going to do a peace with Russia and just strike a deal with Russia?
But what would that look like?
Well, for one, I don't think he can stop Ukrainians from still fighting, but he can cut them off, and then they'll still fight, but eventually, they're going to run out of.
Yeah, and so what happens here, and this is one thing that's important to think about in this conversation. We need to differentiate between the act of fighting from the terms of the peace, right? And so in this case, Trump cuts off Zelenskyy in Ukraine, and Russia has free reign, and Russia conquers Ukraine. It creates guerrilla fighting, and you could say that the war is over, but that's not a political win for Trump, right? Do you think?
No, plus it's, it harkens back to Afghanistan, right? I mean, then Russia's an occupying force in a big country. I mean, that's hard to occupy, Ukraine looks really small until you try to occupy it, right? And so, but you say the trap, so the trap is that he needs a short-term peace deal, but he does still have levers to pressure, and he could threaten all those things, and then the sides could, I
think the more he's engaged in this, right, increasingly he's setting the foreign policy of his presidency to depend on this, and right, if he can't provide the terms that other parties need to stop fighting, then they keep fighting, and then all of a sudden, right, American voters say, for one thing in the back of my mind, I keep thinking about the love affair with North Korea and Kim Jong-un, right? So we had these big talks, we wrote these love letters, we're gonna get a big deal, they're gonna give up their nuclear weapons, and nothing happened. The difference between that situation is you don't have an active war. This one, you got an active war where hundreds of thousands of people are dying, right? So anyway, in terms of delivering here, I think it's going to be really, really hard.
Well, we're going to find out in the coming weeks because it's either going to come to some flurry and conclusion, or it's going to slow way down, and then
we'll slow way down, and then we wait for a military resolution.
Right,
that's even more bloody.
But that's longer, and then it's a problem for politically in domestic politics for Donald Trump. If it does start to just drag on, that's a bad conclusion for Donald Trump.
Thanks for staying with us today.
Sorry,
we went a little bit further.
That's probably my fault.
It's both. We both did it, but we hope you understand. We don't do this lightly. These are ground-shaking developments in the history of the world and in the last century, and so we need to cover them seriously and keep an eye on what's happening right in the developments over the next couple of weeks. These are going to have lasting consequences that are going to reverberate throughout all of our lifetimes.
Definitely matters.
So we'll see you next time.